Hello, I am David Moseley, the Soybean Specialist for the LSU AgCenter. In this video, we will review the 2020 soybean production season in Louisiana and look at some soybean agronomic research from the LSU AgCenter. I would like to thank the Louisiana Soybean and Grain Research and Promotion Board for funding, making soybean agronomic research and demonstrations possible. In 2020, the U.S. soybean acreage increased by an approximate 7%. 83.1 million acres across the United States were planted to soybean. Data from the USDA suggest approximately 89 million acres will be planted to soybean in 2021. The price per bushel of soybean has increased since the 2020 season began, shown in the second graph from the USDA. The Louisiana soybean producers planted a little more than 1 million acres, up 18% from the 2019 season. The average yield in Louisiana was 57 bushels per acre in 2020, up almost 19% from 2019. Good land selection, management, and weather were a few contributing factors in increasing yield. The 2019 planting progress was slow between late March to early April due to dry conditions in the south and wet conditions in the north. However, the planting pace increased between mid-April to mid-May, where a majority of the crop was planted during the optimum planting window. The weather was mostly favorable during the growing season, resulting in a USDA condition rating of at least 85% good to excellent from July 5th to August 23rd. Visual observations led to estimates of high yield potential. However, Hurricane Laura hit landfall on August 29th when the soybean crop was approximately 50% mature and 33% harvested. Paris agents estimated 13 to 16% of the crop was impacted, consisting mostly of light to heavy lodging. The economic impact was estimated to be approximately 1 to 1.5% yield reduction of pre-storm potential or production potential. After Hurricane Laura, the crop rating dropped to 60% good to excellent. On September 17th, Tropical Storm Beta came through, dropping a lot of rain and delaying harvest in some areas. On October 9th, Hurricane Delta hit landfall closely following the path of Hurricane Laura. When Delta hit, approximately 94% of the crop was mature and 90% harvested. Once again, Paris agents estimated flood and wind damage caused an approximate 1% yield reduction of total pre-storm production potential. As the planting season approaches, it is important to consider the recommended planting rates. The recommended seeding rate during the optimum planting window is about 120,000 to 130,000 seeds per acre for a final stand of a little more than 100,000 to 110 or 113,000 plants per acre. This table shows the recommended planting rate for different row widths. The optimum planting window is between mid-April to mid-May, preferably when the soil temperatures have reached at least 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Seeds should be planted between 1 to 2 inches deep, depending on soil moisture conditions with good seed-to-soil contact. When planting early, it is important to check the weather forecast to prevent planting before a cold front, where the soil temperatures might fall below 50 degrees Fahrenheit within 48 hours after planting. Seedlings can be damaged during the rapid water imbibition stage if the soil temperatures fall too low. Seed treatments can increase seedling survivability, especially for early planting dates. Several factors can contribute to poor final stands, including flooding, compaction, poor seed-to-soil contact, and cold and wet soils. Planting early has shown to increase yield potential, but can increase the chance of adverse conditions. Previous data suggests planting rates between 75,000 to 175,000 seeds per acre will not have significantly different yields. However, in this graph, the red bar shows a yield reduction of, after planting, 50,000 plants per acre at the Dean Lee Research Station in 2019. In addition, previous data sets suggest that planting rate less than 75,000 plants per acre can result in lower yield potential. Soybean plants have an amazing ability to compensate for lower populations by filling in gaps with increased branching. Fields that have less than 70,000 plants per acre or uneven emergence with wide gaps may need to be considered for replanting. Wide gaps that will not be covered with the soybean canopy can result in increased weed pressure and decreased irrigation efficiency. Things to consider for determining profitability of replanting include possible additional seed cost, lost yield due to a late planting date, and an increase in pest pressure. Heavy rains can contribute to poor stands by causing flooded or prolonged saturated conditions. In addition, heavy rains soon after planting can cause soil compaction and or leave a crusted barrier on the soil surface. Flooded or prolonged saturated soils can result in depleted soil oxygen levels, which the seedling needs to survive. If the soil compacts or has a crust barrier, the soybean cotyledons and growing point can break off from the hypocotyl and roots. If the growing point is unattached, there would be no additional growth from the seedlings. In order to determine plant stands, random plant counts from at least 10 areas in a field should be conducted. This table provides the length of row from which plants should be counted for different row spacings. Multiply the average of the count taken from multiple areas by 1,000 to get the average plant stand count for the field. For example, for 38-inch rows, if the average plant count from 10 random areas in the field was 80 plants, taken from 13 feet 10-inch row, multiply 80 by 1,000, which gives an average stand count of 80,000 plants. Based on this example, it is likely that it would not be economically beneficial to replant the field if the stand was consistent throughout the field without large gaps. In the left picture, the field was estimated to have more than 80,000 plants with gaps approximately 1 foot wide or less. The recommendation was to not replant. However, in the right picture, the field had areas consisting of less than 70,000 plants per acre and had large gaps. The producer replanted the weak areas by planting into the existing stand. This method can help if the replant is soon enough to not cause excess competition between the plants from the first and second planting, and if the plants from the 2 planting dates mature close enough together to prevent causing harvest delays. If the situation calls for killing plants from the first planting date and starting over, several economical factors should be considered. Economics is an important aspect to consider when deciding whether to replant soybean. Factors that impact the economics of replanting are final plant stand, the date of replanting, and the additional cost of seed and planting. Typically, mid-April to mid-May, planted soybeans will produce the highest yields. Planting later can result in a reduction of yield potential. The economic impact on production costs from replanting can result in an increase in the number of bushels that will be required to offset the incurred production expenses associated with replanting. This will depend on the type of technology, as differences in the prices for seed treatments, and seeding rate can influence the replanting cost. This graph demonstrates the required increase in break-even yields from replanting a 55 bushel per acre potential field across multiple price levels under a discounted seed scenario. As the soybean market price declines, the required increase in break-even yield increases from about 3 bushels per acre at the $12 price to about 4.5 bushels at the $8 price. Different factors can cause seedling damage that can appear severe enough to warrant a replant. It is important to know if the plants will eventually die or fully recover. The picture on the left is showing soybean seedlings planted in April of last year at the Deanley Research Station. Severe weather, including a tornado and approximately 2 to 3 inches of rain, came through soon after planting. The seedlings emerged 8 days later. A pre-emergent program, including Flumi, was applied after planting. I walked this field with Dr. Stevenson, discussing the symptoms, the pre-emergent treatment, and the amount of precipitation after planting. The discussion led to considering the symptoms of the cotyledons to be from Flumi pre-emergent herbicide. However, the plants did grow out of the damage, A good indication they would survive is the minimum damage to the unifoliate leaves shown in the picture on the right. If the field has previously been planted to soybean within the last few years, or if the seed was inoculated with Bradyrhizobium japonicum bacteria, the plants should fix enough nitrogen. However, if the older leaves have a pale green to yellow color, nitrogen deficiency should be considered. By the V3 to V4 growth stage, there should be approximately 8 to 20 active nodules per plant. To determine if a nodule is active, the cross-section view of the nodule should have a pink or red color. If the plants have a nitrogen deficiency, applying supplemental nitrogen may be economical. Use granular dry nitrogen fertilizers that would reduce the chance of burning the foliage. The rate of supplemental nitrogen required depends on soybean growth stage, average yield history, and available nitrogen from the soil. Usually, soybean plants remove approximately 4 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of grain harvested. Last year, there was a field in West Carroll Parish with a poor growing area. Discussion led to prior knowledge of heavy equipment and supplies sitting in the weak area and the fact that the area was known to stay saturated. To test for compaction, a petrometer was used to compare the soil in the poor and good growing areas. Approximately 175 psi was required to push through 2 inches of soil in the good growing areas. However, between 250 and 300 psi was required to push through 2 inches of soil in the poor growing areas. The USDA has previously reported that roots typically will not penetrate soils with a petrometer reading of 300 psi or more. The knowledge of heavy equipment and supplies plus high petrometer readings suggested the poor growth was due to compaction. Compaction can cause poor emergence and growth, resulting in lost yield and increased weed pressure. Field operations during saturated conditions should be limited to prevent soil compaction. If there is a compaction zone, deep vertical tillage is the most direct method to quickly alleviate the compaction layer. Over time, winter cover crops with deep or tap roots can be used to loosen a compacted soil. The cover crops can improve the soil structure and increase organic matter and may help prevent compaction layers from occurring. The first picture shows multiple soybean flowers on a single rachis. Multiple flowers have detached from the rachis in the second picture, and the third shows flowers and pods on the ground. Due to the structure of a soybean flower, most soybean flowers produced will be fertilized. In normal years, even in good environmental conditions, soybean plants will lose over half their fertilized flowers or pods. If the plant is under stressful conditions, abscission of more flowers or pods can occur. Examples of stressful conditions are drought, high temperatures, defoliation, and shade. If abscission occurs to older flowers or pods, soybean plants can compensate by the increased chance of survival of the flowers or pods toward the top of the rachis if the environmental conditions improve. Unfortunately, if the pod survives, any seed within the pod can be terminated at any time. To maximize yield, it is important to maintain as many best management practices as possible throughout the growing and harvest season. There were 2 hurricanes in 2020, Hurricane Laura and Delta. Hurricane Laura hit Louisiana on August 29th. The main damage reported from Laura was light to heavy lodging shown in the first picture. Lodging can reduce scouting and harvest efficiency and can cause yield loss, especially if the pods are touching the ground. Hurricane Delta hit Louisiana on August 9th. The Rice Research Station reported pods were stripped from the plant. After heavy or persistent rain, the seed can imbibe water and swell. The picture on the left shows a split pod with swollen seed after a persistent rain. If the soybean seed imbibes enough moisture in warm temperatures, the seed can germinate in the pod. The second picture shows a seed that germinated in the pod before the entire pod matured. Listed are 3 main objectives for soybean agronomic research. The goal is to communicate with stakeholders to identify key issues and conduct research both on station and on farm to help identify sustainable solutions. The first objective is to evaluate varieties both on research stations and on producer farms. Varieties from companies and university breeding programs are evaluated for yield potential, agronomic traits, and resistance to weathering and disease. Another objective is to evaluate fertilizers and soil amendments to help maximize yield in alkaline or acidic soils. The third objective is to continue to look at the effects from planting dates and plant populations. Historically, we have recommended planting soybean between mid-April to mid-May. However, recently there have been discussions that further research is needed to validate or adjust our recommendations with current production systems and varieties. In 2020, the LSU AgCenter evaluated 154 soybean varieties entered into the official variety trial by 16 seed companies and 2 university soybean breeding programs. The varieties consisted of several different herbicide technologies, and the maturity groups ranged from 3.7 to 6. The trial was replicated at 7 research stations across the state in different soil types, including fine sandy loam, silt loam, sandy, silty clay, and clay. When selecting a variety, the goal is to select for performance and stability. In this case, the variety should show high yield potential in an environment similar to a producer's farm and across multiple locations and years. The graph on the left shows the distribution of maturity groups of the 154 varieties entered into the 2020 official variety trial. 57% of the varieties were between maturity groups 4.5 to 4.9. Another 22% were between maturity groups 5.0 to 5.3, and 14% were between maturity groups 3.0 to 4.4. Although not many, there were 7% that had a maturity group greater than 5.3. The graph on the right shows the distribution of herbicide technology among the OVT varieties. A total of 62% of the varieties were resistant to glyphosate plus dicamba. Almost 16% were resistant to glyphosate, glufosinate plus 2,4-D. The remaining varieties were tolerant to glyphosate or glyphosate plus glufosinate. There were also almost 9.5% of the entries that were conventional varieties. The yield data from the 2020 official variety trials and on-farm demonstrations is published in the 2021 Soybean Variety Yields and Production Practices publication found online and at parish offices. This year, 11 seed companies and 2 university soybean breeding programs entered a total of 43 varieties to be tested in core block on-farm demonstrations. We planted 18 demonstrations across 11 parishes and were able to harvest 14 demonstrations across 9 parishes. There were 6 different herbicide technology packages among the varieties, including Extend, E3, glyphosate plus LibertyLink, glyphosate, SDS, and conventional varieties. The graph on the right shows the distribution of the on-farm variety demonstrations that were planted on producers' farms across the state. In addition to the core block, the LSU AgCenter also conducted a conventional variety trial in Beauregard Parish. We were able to plant 5 conventional varieties from the University of Missouri's soybean breeding program. There were 3 maturity group 4 and 2 maturity group 5 varieties tested next to the core block varieties. The maturity group 4 variety S167922C was within 2 bushels per acre of the core block average. Both maturity group 5 varieties yielded more than the core block average. Pre-harvested mature soybean seed can be damaged by environmental conditions prior to harvest, especially during warm, humid, and persistent rains. If the seed damage is greater than 2%, the grain can be discounted at the elevator. Previous screenings of the official variety trial entries have indicated varieties can express resistance to mature seed weathering damage. To screen the entries, samples are taken from the timely harvest and compared to a delayed harvest. The picture on the left represents seed with no to minimum damage compared to a severe drop in seed quality due to weathering, shown in the picture on the right. In a field with alkaline soil and low soil phosphorus at the Deanley Research Station, there was an indication of a small increase in yield with adding 30 pounds of phosphorus per acre at planting. However, the yield did not increase further until 120 pounds of phosphorus per acre was added. Research suggests a minimum amount of phosphorus is taken up during a vegetative stage, and up to 32% of the season-long phosphorus is taken up after the R5.5 growth stage. Further research will investigate if applying phosphorus at different times of the growing season can help decrease the binding of phosphorus and increase yield. A planting date trial this year at the Deanley Research Station consisted of maturity groups 3, 4, and 5 varieties, with 3 to 4 varieties in each maturity group and 6 planting dates. The planting dates are along the x-axis and the yield is along the y-axis in this graph. For this 1 year of data, there is an indication of possible earlier optimum planting dates than the current recommendation of mid-April to mid-May. This may be due to improved cold tolerance, extended growth stages, and seed treatments. Additional planting date research will continue to be examined. If you have any questions or comments, please contact me at this information shown or contact the parish agent. Thank you.